Thursday, 19 September 1944, dawn broke over the rolling farmland and fog-covered valleys near the small French town of Arracourt, at a moment when the Allied advance into Germany balanced on a fragile edge shaped by fuel shortages, stretched supply lines, and a dangerous assumption that the German army in the West was finished. General George S. Patton's Third Army had raced across France with extraordinary speed, but that speed had created its own vulnerability, exposing American armored units to counterattack just as they began to outrun the logistical system sustaining them. By mid-September, Patton's spearheads had pushed deep into Lorraine, a region of strategic importance not only for its road networks and industrial value, but also for its symbolic meaning to both sides. For the Germans, Lorraine represented a gateway into the Reich that could not be surrendered lightly. For the Americans, it was a necessary corridor toward the Rhine. Yet the terrain itself, low hills, narrow valleys, and frequent morning fog, favored defense and ambush, especially for armored formations forced to operate with limited visibility. The German High Command, desperate to regain the initiative after the collapse in Normandy and the breakout from Falaise, authorized a counteroffensive designed to exploit what they believed were weaknesses in the American advance. The task fell to the 5th Panzer Army, reinforced with newly arrived Panther and Panzer IV tanks, many crewed by experienced veterans pulled from other fronts. German planners assumed that American tank units, reliant on the lightly armored M4 Sherman, could be decisively beaten in a concentrated armored engagement. This assumption rested on technical comparisons rather than operational realities. On paper, German tanks outmatched the Sherman in armor thickness and gun penetration. The Panther's long-barreled 75 gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges far beyond what American tank crews considered safe. German doctrine emphasized using this advantage through long-range engagements, defensive positioning, and coordinated counterattacks. At Arracourt, however, these theoretical advantages collided with the unpredictable pressures of weather, terrain, and command decision-making. Patton's Third Army, and specifically the U.S. 4th Armored Division under Major General John S. Wood, faced the prospect of being struck while overextended. Fuel shortages had forced pauses in the advance, breaking the momentum that Patton valued above all else. Units were dispersed across wide areas, often holding ground with thin defensive screens. Intelligence reports were contradictory, offering warnings of German armor concentration, but lacking precise details. The uncertainty forced American commanders to prepare for multiple contingencies simultaneously. As fog settled over the battlefield in the early hours of 19 September, German armored columns began moving toward American positions. The fog, initially seen as an advantage for the attackers, soon became a source of confusion. Visibility dropped to a few dozen meters, neutralizing long-range gunnery and forcing tank crews on both sides into close-range encounters where reaction time, communication, and coordination mattered more than armor thickness. American tank crews had been trained to fight in combined arms teams rather than as isolated armored units. Shermans operated alongside infantry, tank destroyers, artillery observers, and reconnaissance elements. This integration allowed American commanders to respond flexibly to sudden threats. When German tanks emerged from the fog, American units did not rely solely on tank versus tank combat, but called in artillery fire, redirected tank destroyers, and maneuvered to exploit flanks and rear approaches. Artillery played a decisive role at Arracourt. American forward observers, often operating under extreme pressure and limited visibility, directed massed artillery barrages against suspected German assembly areas. The fog that hindered direct fire made indirect fire more effective, as German units had difficulty identifying where shells were coming from or coordinating movements under bombardment. Artillery disrupted German formations before they could fully deploy, breaking the cohesion essential to a successful armored assault. German commanders faced their own pressures. Orders from higher headquarters emphasized urgency, demanding quick results to stabilize the front. This pressure reduced the time available for reconnaissance and coordination, leading to piecemeal attacks rather than a single, overwhelming blow. As individual German units advanced independently, they encountered American forces prepared to react locally, turning the battlefield into a series of chaotic, overlapping engagements rather than a clean armored clash. The Shermans' perceived inferiority became less relevant in this environment. At close range, American crews could engage German tanks effectively, especially when attacking from unexpected angles. Shermans equipped with 76 guns and high-velocity ammunition proved capable of destroying Panthers when fired at vulnerable points. Even standard 75 Shermans contributed by suppressing enemy crews, damaging tracks, or forcing German tanks to button up, reducing their situational awareness. Pressure at the tactical level mirrored pressure at the operational level. American commanders understood that a successful German counterattack could stall the Third Army's advance and undermine confidence in armored doctrine. Failure at Arracourt would have consequences beyond the immediate battlefield, potentially validating German assumptions about tank superiority and influencing Allied planning across the Western Front. As the fighting continued over several days, weather conditions shifted unpredictably. Fog lifted and returned, rain turned fields into mud, and visibility fluctuated without warning. Each change altered the balance of advantage. American units adapted by repositioning frequently, maintaining communication, and avoiding static defense. German units, constrained by fuel shortages and rigid orders, struggled to maintain momentum. The cumulative effect of these engagements became apparent as German losses mounted. Tanks destroyed or abandoned littered the fields around Arracourt, not as the result of a single decisive clash, but through sustained attrition driven by American coordination and adaptability. The figure often cited, around 200 German armored vehicles destroyed or rendered ineffective, reflects the scale of the defeat rather than a single day's outcome. Patton closely followed the battle, interpreting its lessons through his broader philosophy of warfare. He did not attribute success to the Sherman alone, nor did he dismiss the technical advantages of German armor. Instead, he emphasized speed of decision, aggressive leadership, and the relentless application of pressure. Arracourt reinforced his belief that initiative could compensate for material disadvantages, provided commanders acted decisively under uncertainty. The German failure at Arracourt marked a turning point in the Lorraine campaign. The counteroffensive exhausted valuable armored reserves that could not be easily replaced. It also demonstrated that German armored doctrine, increasingly constrained by shortages and command interference, could no longer deliver decisive results against a coordinated Allied force. For American forces, Arracourt validated the principles underpinning their armored doctrine. The battle showed that victory emerged not from technical superiority alone, but from the integration of intelligence, artillery, armor, and command flexibility. The consequences extended beyond Lorraine, shaping how American units approached subsequent engagements on the road to the German border. The pressure faced by both sides at Arracourt reveals the nature of World War II combat in its later stages. A contest defined less by surprise breakthroughs and more by the ability to manage uncertainty, absorb losses, and maintain operational coherence. Decisions made under fog, fuel scarcity, and incomplete information shaped outcomes that reverberated far beyond the fields of eastern France, leaving the story open for continued examination of how doctrine, leadership, and circumstance converged in one of the war's most instructive armored battles. In the days following the main clashes around Arracourt, the operational picture grew more complex rather than more settled. German commanders attempted to reorganize surviving units, shifting armor under cover of darkness and poor weather in hopes of restoring some measure of coherence to their counterattack. These movements, however, were constrained by fuel shortages that had become endemic across the Western Front. Tanks that could still fight were often immobilized by empty fuel tanks, forcing crews to abandon otherwise serviceable vehicles. This logistical reality transformed battlefield losses into strategic losses, compounding the effects of American firepower. American intelligence officers began piecing together a clearer understanding of the scale of German commitment. Prisoners of war reported rushed deployments, incomplete training among replacement crews, and confusion stemming from conflicting orders issued by higher headquarters. These accounts reinforced the impression that the German counteroffensive had been driven as much by desperation as by coherent strategy. For Patton's staff, this intelligence confirmed that the enemy was expending irreplaceable resources in an attempt to regain initiative, a gamble that carried enormous risk. The 4th Armored Division, having absorbed the shock of the initial assaults, transitioned from reactive defense to controlled offense. Tank battalions probed forward cautiously, supported by infantry and reconnaissance elements tasked with identifying remaining pockets of resistance. Artillery remained on constant alert, prepared to respond to even minor indications of German movement. The cumulative experience of recent days had sharpened American responsiveness. Units now anticipated counterattacks rather than being surprised by them. Weather continued to influence decision-making. Morning fog still limited visibility, but American commanders had learned to exploit it as effectively as their opponents. Movements were timed to coincide with low visibility, reducing exposure to long-range fire while allowing American forces to reposition. When the fog lifted, artillery and air observers took advantage of clearer conditions to strike exposed German units attempting to regroup. This rhythm of concealment and exposure became a defining feature of the fighting. The psychological dimension of the battle grew increasingly evident. German crews, already strained by losses and isolation, faced a persistent sense of vulnerability. Reports described tanks advancing cautiously, halting frequently, and dispersing to avoid detection, behaviors that reduced their ability to mass force. American crews, while fully aware of the dangers posed by German guns, gained confidence from repeated successful engagements. This confidence did not eliminate fear, but it altered behavior, encouraging initiative and rapid decision-making at the platoon and company levels. Patton's influence remained indirect but significant. His emphasis on aggressive posture shaped the orders transmitted down the chain of command. Rather than consolidating defensively and waiting for further attacks, American units were encouraged to maintain pressure, denying the enemy time to recover. This approach reflected Patton's broader belief that momentum itself was a weapon capable of magnifying the effects of limited resources. German attempts to reassert control were further undermined by Allied air superiority. As weather conditions improved intermittently, fighter-bombers targeted movement along roads and assembly areas. Even when air attacks did not destroy vehicles outright, they disrupted schedules, scattered formations, and forced crews to conceal themselves during daylight hours. The cumulative effect was to compress German operational timelines, making coordinated action increasingly difficult. The battle's logistical implications extended beyond immediate losses. German repair units, already overstretched, were unable to recover or refurbish damaged vehicles at the pace required. Spare parts were scarce, and transport capacity was limited. Each disabled tank represented not just a tactical setback, but a permanent reduction in combat power. American logistics, though strained, proved more resilient, allowing damaged Shermans to be repaired or replaced with relative speed. As engagements tapered in intensity, the broader significance of Arracourt began to crystallize. The failure of the counteroffensive confirmed that German armored forces in the West could no longer conduct large-scale offensive operations with any reasonable expectation of success. This realization influenced subsequent German defensive planning, reinforcing a shift toward delaying actions rather than decisive counterblows. For American commanders, Arracourt became a case study in adaptive warfare. After-action reports emphasized coordination, communication, and the intelligent use of supporting arms. Technical shortcomings were acknowledged, but they were framed within a context that highlighted how doctrine and leadership mitigated those weaknesses. The experience reinforced confidence in the combined arms approach that would be applied repeatedly in later operations. The human cost of the fighting was evident across the battlefield. Wrecked vehicles, scattered equipment, and hastily marked graves testified to the intensity of the struggle. Soldiers on both sides confronted the aftermath with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Aware that survival owed as much to circumstance as to skill, these moments underscored the ever-present uncertainty that defined armored warfare, where advantage could shift with weather, terrain, or a single decision made under pressure. Arracourt's legacy continued to shape the campaign in Lorraine. The destruction of German armor eased pressure on adjacent American units, allowing a cautious resumption of the advance despite ongoing logistical challenges. Yet the battle also served as a reminder that success was provisional. Fuel shortages, stubborn resistance, and the approach of winter ensured that momentum would remain contested. In this sense, Arracourt stands not as an isolated triumph, but as a revealing episode within a broader narrative of World War II. It demonstrates how outcomes were forged through the interaction of doctrine, leadership, environment, and human endurance. The decisions made amid fog and uncertainty carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, inviting continued examination of how armies adapted, endured, and learned as the war pressed inexorably toward its final phases. As the Third Army consolidated its positions after Arracourt, attention shifted to how the battle influenced planning at higher levels of command. Reports from Lorraine moved rapidly up the chain, reaching headquarters that were reassessing assumptions about armored warfare in the European theater. Analysts noted that German losses at Arracourt were not merely the result of numerical disadvantage, but of systemic breakdowns in coordination, logistics, and command responsiveness. These observations fed into broader evaluations of how the German army was adapting, or failing to adapt, to the realities of late 1944. Patton's staff used the experience to refine operational directives. Emphasis was placed on maintaining flexible reserves capable of responding to sudden counterattacks, particularly in terrain that favored concealment. Arracourt demonstrated that even a weakened enemy could deliver sharp blows if given time and space. This lesson reinforced Patton's insistence on forward pressure balanced by readiness, a combination that required constant situational awareness and rapid dissemination of information. The battle also influenced training within the Third Army. Crews rotated briefly out of the line to absorb lessons learned, sharing practical insights about fighting in fog, coordinating with artillery, and exploiting fleeting opportunities. These informal exchanges complemented formal after-action reviews, creating a feedback loop between experience and doctrine. The cumulative effect was a gradual improvement in unit cohesion and confidence, even as operational tempo remained demanding. German responses to the defeat were constrained by realities beyond the battlefield. High Command issued directives emphasizing conservation of remaining armored assets, acknowledging implicitly that the era of large-scale counteroffensives in the West was ending. Yet political pressures and ideological rigidity limited the extent to which commanders could adapt. Orders often demanded resistance beyond what conditions allowed, perpetuating a cycle of attrition that eroded combat effectiveness. Arracourt also highlighted the growing disparity in industrial capacity. While American factories continued to produce tanks, spare parts, and ammunition at a steady pace, German production faced disruption from bombing, resource shortages, and transportation breakdowns. This imbalance meant that losses suffered in Lorraine could not be offset, transforming tactical defeats into strategic setbacks. The battlefield thus reflected the deeper economic dimensions of World War II, where production and supply were as decisive as firepower. At the tactical level, American units refined their approach to reconnaissance. The fog and rolling terrain of Lorraine underscored the importance of early warning and accurate intelligence. Recon elements adapted by using dismounted patrols, listening posts, and coordinated observation with artillery units. These measures reduced surprise and enhanced the ability to shape engagements before they escalated into full-scale clashes. The psychological impact of Arracourt lingered among German forces. Accounts from prisoners and intercepted communications revealed declining confidence in armored doctrine that had once been central to German military identity. Repeated encounters in which technical superiority failed to deliver victory forced a reassessment of long-held assumptions. This erosion of confidence affected decision-making, making commanders more cautious and less willing to commit their remaining assets decisively. For American soldiers, the battle reinforced a sense of professional competence rather than invulnerability. The losses sustained, though lighter than those of the enemy, were significant enough to temper overconfidence. Veterans recalled Arracourt as a reminder that success depended on constant vigilance and adaptation. The experience strengthened respect for the enemy's capabilities while affirming the effectiveness of American methods. As autumn deepened, the campaign in Lorraine settled into a grinding struggle against terrain, weather, and determined resistance. Arracourt's lessons continued to inform daily operations, shaping how units approached defensive preparations and limited offensives. The battle became a reference point, cited in briefings and discussions as an example of how pressure and uncertainty could be managed through disciplined command. In the broader narrative of the war, Arracourt occupies a space between breakthrough and stalemate. It did not open the road to Germany immediately, nor did it mark a decisive collapse of enemy resistance. Instead, it demonstrated the erosion of German offensive capability and the maturation of American armored warfare. This intermediate character makes the battle particularly valuable for analysis, revealing the processes by which armies learn and adapt under sustained stress. The unfolding campaign would continue to test these lessons. Winter conditions, shifting strategic priorities, and the looming Ardennes offensive would challenge assumptions once again. Yet the experience at Arracourt remained embedded in the institutional memory of the Third Army, influencing how commanders interpreted new threats and opportunities as World War II moved into its final, most demanding phase. As October advanced, the operational environment around Lorraine grew harsher, testing the durability of the lessons learned at Arracourt. Rain softened roads and fields, turning maneuver into a logistical puzzle and slowing the movement of heavy vehicles. American commanders were forced to reconcile Patton's instinct for rapid advance with the physical limits imposed by terrain and weather. The memory of Arracourt influenced these decisions, reinforcing the idea that momentum had to be preserved intelligently rather than recklessly. German forces, though weakened, attempted to exploit these conditions through delaying actions and localized counterattacks. Without the massed armor required for decisive blows, they relied on terrain familiarity and defensive positioning to extract time from the advancing Americans. These tactics underscored the continuing relevance of uncertainty in the campaign. Even after a significant defeat, the enemy retained the ability to impose costs and shape the pace of operations. Within the Third Army, coordination between armor and infantry deepened. Arracourt had shown that tanks operating without close support were vulnerable, especially in reduced visibility. Infantry units became integral to screening advances, clearing wooded areas, and protecting flanks. This integration reduced the likelihood of surprise and allowed armored units to concentrate on mobility and firepower. The evolving relationship reflected an adaptive process driven by recent experience rather than abstract doctrine. Artillery units continued to refine their procedures. The effectiveness of massed fires at Arracourt encouraged further experimentation with rapid concentration and flexible targeting. Forward observers gained greater autonomy, trusted to call fire based on fleeting opportunities. This trust accelerated response times and increased the psychological pressure on German units, who found it increasingly difficult to move without drawing attention. Patton's leadership style remained a subject of internal discussion. Some officers viewed his relentless drive as a necessary counterweight to the inertia that often followed intense fighting. Others worried that fatigue and supply constraints could erode combat effectiveness if pressure was maintained without pause. Arracourt provided a framework for this debate, illustrating both the benefits and risks of aggressive command under uncertain conditions. German command challenges persisted. Communications disruptions, exacerbated by Allied air activity and partisan interference, limited situational awareness. Orders issued from higher headquarters often lagged behind events, forcing frontline commanders to improvise. This disconnect highlighted the widening gap between intent and capability within the German army, a gap that had been exposed starkly during the failed counteroffensive. The experience of tank crews at Arracourt continued to shape training and expectations. New crews arriving at the front were briefed extensively on the realities of combat against German armor, emphasizing awareness, coordination, and discipline over reliance on technical specifications. Veterans stressed that survival depended on teamwork and adaptability, lessons born directly from the fog-shrouded engagements of September. From a strategic perspective, Arracourt contributed to a reassessment of German intentions in the West. Intelligence analysts concluded that while localized resistance would remain intense, the likelihood of large-scale armored counteroffensives outside carefully prepared circumstances was diminishing. This assessment influenced resource allocation, allowing Allied planners to prioritize sustained pressure across multiple fronts rather than concentrating exclusively on armored threats. The battlefield itself bore lasting marks of the fighting. Wrecked vehicles remained visible for weeks, serving as stark reminders of the costs of miscalculation. For soldiers passing through the area later, these remnants reinforced the sense that success in war was cumulative, built from countless decisions made under imperfect conditions rather than from singular moments of triumph. As the campaign moved forward, the lessons of Arracourt blended into the broader fabric of the war. They informed how commanders interpreted new challenges, how units prepared for unexpected contact, and how leadership balanced urgency with caution. The battle's significance lay not only in the number of tanks destroyed, but in the clarity it provided about the nature of modern warfare, where pressure, uncertainty, and consequence were inseparable elements, shaping every action as World War II continued toward its decisive final chapters.